Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and a privilege for me to be here back with you. May I just begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land, pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. It's great to think about lessons from the past, and what I want to do is also do a bit of pointers to the future. And of course I've put up my favourite map here to start us off, the centred on Darwin, the RAF planning map, but spun 45 degrees to give you a sense of Australia hanging off Southeast Asia, and also that sense of the Indo-Pacific, which becomes so blindingly obvious when you look at the map that way. So, just a bit of background noise to the formulation of this presentation. I've been thinking about these issues for a little while and been writing a little bit about it over a number of issues and a number of publications over the years. And the last couple of ones are on the Korean War and on our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, niche wars, which I'll talk about in a second. Korean War, this one in from the cold. Australia's commitment was unexpected. Nobody in December 1949 thought we'd be sending troops to Korea in June the following year. It just seemed completely inconceivable, but then we were. And part of that was the policy reversion of the United States that Dean Acheson in, I think, February, January, early 1950 had said, no, look, we're not going to bother with Taiwan and Korea. We're just going to give them up. And of course, the imperatives of the politics of democracy, when something like that happens, got caught up, and all of a sudden, they were involved and we were involved. The ANZUS alliance emerged as a result, and I would put to you, that not direct, but there are some interesting parallels there to what conceivably could happen in Taiwan. And all the talk, and there's some Twitter talk this afternoon following a piece by Malcolm Davis about defending Taiwan, about how we might actually become compelled to do something if it comes to that. I thought we'll hold on to that one for a bit. Niche wars. This is very happy to see this book out just recently. I have one copy in my bag, and it's one of those which is I've got In From the Cold, which you can see there. It's a free download from ANU Press, and same with Niche Wars. Niche Wars got that kind of nice feel, you know. It feels like it's a good book, and it's got some good pickies too and diagrams. So for us simple people, you know, who like to keep it simple and like diagrams, perfect book. But then I'm being a bit distracted. This book tries to answer the question how and why Australia was involved. And one of the points I would make is that it demonstrates that Australia acted as a middle power, but with small power pretensions. We didn't drive strategy. We really didn't buy in on it until way too late. We basically let the Americans tell us what they were going to do and then buy in on it on the sides. And of course, we know how that ended up. Of course, the thinking was largely about the alliance, not exclusively, but I would put to you that it was a bit of a distraction from the ADF's regional focus, a bit like playing primary school soccer. So, you know how a primary school soccer team will follow the ball, everyone hold their positions, anybody who had any thrusting bone in their body, wanting to get promoted, knew that they had to do something in the MEO, so you had to blow off concerns about Southeast Asia, get yourself a hit in the sandpit, and in Iraq or Afghanistan, and then the chance of promotion would command, operational command, you know, all that kind of stuff, great stuff. And it was completely distracting strategically from our patch. The Americans thought we still cared about and knew about Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Little did they realise that we could barely walk and chew gum, unfortunately. So, the pointer for today, I would contend, is that what we're talking about here, were niche wars for Australia. We sent calibrated, very carefully constrained force contributions to work with allies. The future probably won't be like that. And we really should buy in on the strategy, because the stakes will probably be much higher for us than they've been here. Now, my thinking is also informed by the SWOT analysis I conducted back in 2019, and it's been kind of on my mind ever since. And you see there in the square or the rectangle the idea of the internal strengths and weaknesses and the external opportunities and threats, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you like. If you haven't read it, I committed to it. It's also a free download. But in essence, when you think about that SWOT, to me, as I say, I like things simple and I like pickies, right? To me, it comes down to three things. Great power contestation, looming environmental catastrophe, and a spectrum of governance challenges leading to the breakdown of law and order, particularly in the Pacific, but also in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And it's the overlap that is presenting a massive conundrum beyond any single government department, any state or federal jurisdiction, any academic discipline, any known entity. No one's got their head around this. So, as we think about where we are today, I would put to you that US ideational leadership, which has been missing for the last few years, its recovery is in doubt, in part because of the shambolic response to the pandemic, in part because of the ongoing domestic political division in the United States, the enduring strife, the damaged brand, the risk of reversion in 4 years' time. Joe Biden's making all these wonderful pronouncements about democracy and the rules-based order. Well, what happens if he's a one-termer? The limited prospects of economic recovery. I mean, we all wish them well, but it doesn't look all that promising. And we've seen this with the EU hedging in their engagement with China. And interestingly enough, they've bought out of the major trading arrangements, the RCEP and the CPTPP. Sam Roggeveen recently wrote, after the Trump years, protests and pandemics, the US is in a defensive crouch rather than in an expansion mood. And I think there's some truth to that, despite what Joe Biden might say. Hugh White, my colleague at the STSC, has really talked about distancing Australia from America. My distillation, and it's my take on what he says, is that Australia needs to give up its South Pacific dream. The US shouldn't go to war with China over Taiwan, and nor should Australia. It's all well and good. The US can't win and must make room for China. And we want America to remain, but China's demands will be too great. The USA won't win and won't stay. And so we should act accordingly. That's my, as I say, I like to keep it simple. That's my sense of what he's saying. But is that too binary? And is it too pessimistic? My sense it is. And my sense is we need to also be mindful of the sunk costs in the alliance and how we can capitalise on them to the best effect. And I would put you to some other options, short of the binary proposition that seems to be behind Hugh's argument, which we'll explore. Let's just touch on Joe Biden and what he's saying. Now, he's come out saying we're going to talk about climate change, number one, racial injustice, economy, healthcare, the pandemic, in other words, immigration, and restoring America's global standing. Talk about buying back into world UN bodies, talking even today in this conversation with President Xi, talking about engaging on security and pushing back and even defending NATO, Taiwan. And so there's some sense that he's into the Quad, he's into NATO, so there's some assurance there that he's going to buy into that. No assurance on the economic side of the equation, on trade and economics, which is a little bit disconcerting, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Richard Haas has come out with Chair of the Council of Foreign Relations in the United States, talked about the shape of Biden's foreign policy as being rebuilding at home, working with allies, embracing diplomacy, participating in international institutions, and advocating for democracy. Now, this one's a little bit problematic when you've got countries like China who don't really care about democracy, and in fact kind of don't want democracy, particularly in places like Taiwan. And of course, then Myanmar's presented another headache, because we can talk about that afterwards, but there's lots of issues here. It's problematic. how we go ahead on this is going to be tricky. And then we see, of course, the other side of the equation is President Xi and the Global China 2049 initiative, coupled with wolf warrior diplomacy, the exercise of sharp power that's intimidated South Korea, Japan, Australia, Canada, Norway, just about anybody. So they've all been singled out, okay? So there's a large number of countries who've been singled out. My point is, they're not single. There's a lot of us, we're all in the same kind of boat. But this is the rhetoric we get. So he's aiming for the PLA, People's Liberation Army, its modernisation to be completed by 2035. That's 15 years away. And he's focusing on a swag of things, on cyber, on space, on nuclear, hypersonic, stealth, on autonomous platforms, joint capabilities. They've got joint commands. 10 years ago, we lampooned China for its lack of jointery. They are completely reinventing themselves in that space and operating very much in the grey zone, below the threshold to invoke a kinetic military response. And also, obviously, looking to that idea of the fully developed nation, incorporating Taiwan, preferably well before 2049, by at least 2049, the century after the century of humiliation ended, with the establishment of the People's Republic of China in October 1949. Now, Kevin Rudd, our resident Mandarin-speaking former Prime Minister, has come out with a pretty good piece recently with the Asia Institute, talking about managing the strategic competition between China and the United States. He's come up with a number of proposals. Both sides should abstain from cyber attacks. US should return to a one China policy. China should dial back its provocations over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands and in the South China Sea, and respect freedom of navigation for navies like Australia's and others. He said we should allow and recognise that there'll be global economic competition, and attempts to win hearts and minds will continue, and that collaboration opportunities should be explored on climate, on managing North Korea and Iran, in response to the pandemic, and in response to humanitarian assistance and disaster relief opportunities. Most of these points have significant implications for Australia and how we respond. If Joe Biden follows this line, if she buys it too, this will have enormous implications. Although we are already seeing the early signs are that Joe Biden is not going to follow this line. The phone call, the transcript of the reporting of the phone call would suggest that they're not. The one China policy is being played within the margins. Now, Keyshawn Johnson, the sort of rogue Singaporean ex-diplomat who's got a lot of airplay because he's really saying some things that people hate to hear and are provocative and to a certain extent quite compelling. He's made the point that, look, the Quad's okay, but economics is where the big game's playing, and the United States and India aren't playing in the big game. They've both avoided the TPP and the RCEP, and they've essentially ceded the ground to China. So if economics is the grounds, the basis from which you build your power, building a military alliance isn't necessarily going to compensate sufficiently. Now, economics and power are clearly linked, and I want to just dwell on it for a moment because it's important. The United States' power does derive from its economic strength. There's no question about that. You can't sustain a 12-carrier fleet without having a shed load of moolah, right? You've got to pay for it. You've got to somehow sustain that with resources. It costs. They're very expensive. So you've got to be wealthy. And its evident economic eclipse puts that at risk of continuing. Now, the enduring geostrategic dynamics of the United States' position and assets are clearly in the United States' favour. And I put this map here because people forget. The United States is a really dynamic country, in part because of its geography and its people, its history, its circumstances. It's really got two oceans either side, two friendly nations either side, It's got a lot of advantages, including a massive river system that enables the inland to be capitalised on and exploited and resources developed. But a focus on bolstering military power and alliances is not enough. And the economic dynamism and the trade partnerships, I would contend, are key. And yet we have had a period of, I think, a couple of decades now since the so-called global war on terror, where the United States has focused on military prowess and has fumbled on the economic front. We're seeing complementing that is China's economic pressure on Australia. We've seen the sanctions, beef, barley, coal, wine, etc. But I'm a little bit of a sceptic on that front, I have to admit. Because when you think about it, there's a global dynamic equilibrium in markets. The global markets are not a command economy. Now, President Xi might want them to be a command economy. He might want them to be responsive to interactions. The bottom line is that it's about supply and demand. So if the barley growers in, say, Argentina sell their barley to China, then the market that barley might have gone to is now open for an Australian sale. Now, that depends on whether the crops are good that year or not, and whether there's a demand has grown or shrunk. So there are many factors there that are actually beyond President Xi's control. And it's one of the reasons I would contend why actually our economy, despite all these sanctions, seems to be doing so well. And I would contend also that what we are seeing is a situation akin to the inflection point of 1973 when Britain joined the European Economic Community. It was devastating. The sky was falling. The Kiwis were hit much harder than we were, but poor old Gough Whitlam, with his great agenda, suffered at the hands of a set of circumstances completely beyond his control. And we got over it. We actually have prospered pretty well since then. In fact, you don't even really think about going back to what we had back then. So I would contend that while this is different, there are parallels there that I think give us some hope that this is not the end of the road. Beyond that, we also have a range of opportunities, free trade arrangement related opportunities that are largely unexplored. And that's partly because it was so much easier just dealing with China. All you really needed was one handler, one interpreter, and you could go around, do the maintenance, and flog off whatever primary resource Australia had got. Okay? Easy. Really, it's pretty straightforward. Doing business with an Indonesia, or India, or a Malaysia, or a Thailand, or a Philippines, that's harder. You're going to have to put some elbow grease to make that work, right? And you're going to need more than one handler, and more than one language. Dang, that's a lot of work. Well, folks, that's, I think, the new reality. And I think so I'm not saying that this is going to be wonderful, but I would contend that we should be careful of being too doom and gloom about what China's sanctions actually mean for us and also for others who are looking on thinking, that's a bit obnoxious. So what? Well, we want to avert catastrophe, and then this is one of the things I was saying with the SWOT analysis we came out a couple of years ago. There are a spectrum of security challenges we face, and they interact with each other. They overlap, and they reap all sorts of consequences, one of which was, of course, the pandemic, and the consequences of that. Now, back in 2017, the Australian government declared a foreign policy white paper, what I call Australia's Foreign Policy Plan B. It was after the Trump administration came to office. It reflected the US transactional retreat from ideational leadership, and it stressed a number of things that I believe still apply. The importance of engaging with our neighbours in what people are calling the Indo-Pacific. The US engagement remains welcome, but we need to be aware of the uncertainties that go with that. I think we need to make as much as we can of the Quad, but at the same time have modest expectations, not bank on it too much. Make it work as best we can, yep. Japan scholars seem to be saying the same sort of thing. Let's try and make it work, but let's keep our eyes open and not put all our eggs in the one basket. ASEAN, we had the special summit back in 2018 when I think Malcolm Turnbull's one of his last acts as Prime Minister. The Pacific Step Up is on its way, and there it talked about bolstering regional and economic and trade ties. These are all things that are still, in my view, legitimate. When we think about the Defence Force Structure Plan and the Defence Strategic Update of 2020, there were three things there it talked about, which was a heartening and refreshing shift away from saying we're going to be able to do everything around the world. Became much more focused on the neighbourhood, to shape, to deter and to respond, and stressing things in the capability plan relating to realistic things concerning grey zone operations. In cyberspace, in space, bolstering joint capabilities, and doubling down on industry. But is this all enough? I would contend it's going in the right direction, but we've still got further to go. Now that's complicated by the fact that events get in the way. Pandemics, fires, floods, tempests, cyber attacks, terrorism. Now we haven't had a major disruption from terrorism in Australia for a while, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't remain vigilant. And it can come from a wide variety of angles, as was demonstrated in New Zealand not that long ago. Chris Flaherty, a friend of mine, came up with this, talked about 5 waves. And there's a question about how much a US president and how much a good faithful ally like Australia can really do about all of this. These are things that are happening. Events, dear boy, events. They get in the way, all right? And arguably we are facing the political and social crisis he identifies as our third crisis. We need to try and work to avoid the fourth one, war and conflict, and of course work doubly hard to avoid the fifth one, the environmental crisis, the green one on the right. Meanwhile, there are a swag of plausible concurrent ADF support demands. Now, up until now, we've done pretty well at handling things consecutively. You can handle a bushfire, then a flood, then a pandemic. Now it's a strain, and you ask people in the ADF how they're going, their lives have been disrupted by it, but it's manageable. You have to drop your training standards, you have to turn off some of the major exercises, you have to redirect your funds, you have to maybe change posting plans, but by and large, in peacetime, it's manageable. What happens if it gets more complicated than that? And they start happening, some of these scenarios start happening concurrently. We are not remotely postured for that to happen. So, my colleague and friend Brendan Taylor wrote the Four Flashpoints. He talked about Korea, the East China Sea, basically the Senkaku Islands, or what China calls the Diaoyu Islands, Taiwan, and the South China Sea, okay? The big 4 flashpoints. What he didn't talk about, it really blown up since he wrote the book, was the line of actual control in the Himalayas and other issues like that. Taiwan is the one that's kind of flavour of the month at the moment, and he wrote this book, Dangerous Decade, in which he identified the key findings as tensions between Taiwan and China are rising, consequences of failing to help de-escalate tensions will be serious, and Australia really should work with other regional powers to advocate for more robust risk avoidance and crisis management mechanisms. Now, Linda Jacobson's come out just recently with a piece, What Does China Want? Very interesting article in which she argues that outright war over Taiwan is unlikely, despite all these prognostications. And she says that China is likely will use all means short of war, interestingly enough. and its pressure campaign will be to force unification negotiations. There will be no individual action by China which would warrant a military response. The mix of tactics will be military intimidation, disinformation, cyber attacks. And the USA and Australia and anyone else would be hard-pressed to counter these moves. This is Sunza, eat your heart out. The acme of skill is to defeat your adversary without fighting. Beautiful. If you can pull it off, impressive. So, one of my PhD students, now promoted Colonel Nick Bosio, came up with this graph, this chart, which is used in his PhD thesis. I reckon it's a cracker. Really helpful distillation of the challenge, the conundrum we face. The ADF is essentially geared for that, and a bit of HADR off to the side, right? But this conflict and competition stuff, now that's really a conundrum. Because what are you going to do? You can't drop bombs and missiles on that. It just doesn't work. Russ Glenn, who used to be at ANU with me and taught here at Staff College, he's just come out with another piece where it complements the thinking on this, what he calls sub-threshold manoeuvre and the flanking of US national security, in which he says adversaries, both near-peer and non-state actors, recognise America's dominance in conventional warfare. We all do now, right? But instead they seek to shape and achieve objectives below the threshold of kinetic conflict, using cyber and information operations. Encountering their sub-threshold manoeuvre in this era of competition, crisis, conflict and change requires a sea change in how to organise and apply national security structure to deter, and if you can't deter, to engage successfully. Another piece that's caught my eye and seems to resonate with this line of thinking is this one on innovation wars, which came out in Foreign Affairs just the other day, about America's eroding technological advantage, in which you can see there Beijing's playing a sophisticated game using technological innovation to advance its goals without resort to war. Chinese companies selling 5G wireless infrastructure, harnessing synthetic biology, racing to build smaller and faster microchips, all to grow China's power. And that technological supremacy promises the ability to dominate the civilian infrastructure, providing enormous influence, economic power. China envisages a world of great power competition in which no shots need to be fired, in which case the forces that Russ Glenn identified as being irrelevant leave us with a conundrum. So, going back to the next idea, this space, this cyber warfare, this grey zone conflict, happening in this space, short of war, largely, short of justifying a full kinetic response, is presenting an enormous conundrum and is seeing us in the liberal democratic West, and in Australia in particular, fumble around, struggling to reconcile our understanding of the world with what we're seeing. So I would put to you that we actually need to look a bit beyond the defence update of 2020. Parking what I just said for a moment, I want to return to Australia's circumstances. And I think there is enduring significance of our geography. And there are limited echoes of World War II and the lead up to World War II. And they're limited, right? It's not a perfect facsimile, but there are factors at play with the surge in great power contestation that has relevance as we think about this. But we have underinvested in our regional security ties. Who in the ADF today speaks Bahasa Indonesia? I asked Staff College last year, I think 2 hands went up. We dropped the ball, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Paul Dibb, another one of my colleagues at STSC, essentially wrote the Defence Australia white paper in '87. But that really, in a scenario where we didn't have a foreseeable adversary, concocted one, essentially out of flipping a confrontasi-like scenario from Borneo onto Australia's shores. And that was then used as justification for 4 structured decisions. Okay? That's in a nutshell. What I would put to you is that we need to have an inverted DOA for the future. Now, I think, we need to see Indonesia as a vital partner, not as a confrontasi-like potential adversary. And if we reinvent our thinking about the importance of our engagement with the neighbourhood, I think we'll go a long way to mitigating some of the risks we face. Now, Peter Goon and Carlo Kopp have generated considerable controversy over years by decrying the capabilities of the F-35 and the 5G RAF, the 5th generation Air Force. Okay? Now, I'm not an expert in this space, but I do think he makes some very good points about the need for us to think more deeply, more holistically about the capabilities we're developing and the potential capabilities that might be deployed against them. And here this graph shows some concerns about various Chinese, Russian primarily, and Chinese aircraft that, if he is correct, can operate far above the level that we can operate. And that has significant implications, which I don't think we've thought through. And when we think about our neighbourhood, and I am a historian by academic training, and I love geography, and that's partly, I think, my Intel background. I love maps, just can't have enough maps. Right? If you think about history and geography, in extremis, the archipelagic defensive action of 1941 and 42 actually made sense. Now, the air bases in Kupang, Ambon, Java, it made sense to deploy forces there. We just didn't send enough, and we didn't think through the ramifications, what it would cost to defend those. And we should have done that a decade earlier, but we didn't. And when it came to it, we rushed troops in because we knew that if Japan was going to strike Australia, it would have to use air bases in those locations. So we tried to get them. So, and then when we went back later in 44, 45, you can see there in the green circles or loops, the other half of what is now Indonesia became our forward operating areas. Ladies and gentlemen, that geography has not changed. What was the Dutch East Indies is now Indonesia. And as I say, it is shocking to think about how few people speak Bahasa, how little we know about this space where, when we last faced an existential threat, we had to operate. So, let's just think for a moment about a potential future in extremis archipelagic action. It's quite possible and it's conceivable that there may be a requirement to operate in and through the archipelago. But we know that the F-35 has significant range limitations. The red loops, the red circles are essentially the range from the air bases across Australia of the F-35. Now, they're stealthy, right? That ain't stealthy. They are very easy to identify. And an F-35 operating beyond the range of those circles, the red circles, requires refueling and requires to expose itself to an extreme degree of vulnerability. So, to mitigate that, to operate north of Australia in a DOA plus construct, we would need to operate in effect like with lily pads, basing forward, akin to what we did, what we sought to do, but failed in the initial phases of the war in the Pacific, but then subsequently did in 44-45. But Indonesia's an independent nation, so we can't do this without their collaboration. So the only way we can do this is if Indonesia thinks it's a good idea. Otherwise, we can only operate from Australia. There's no way we can do anything other than do this with their support. But how much effort are we putting into ingratiating ourselves with our neighbours? How much effort are we putting into making them trust us and making them see us as their natural security partners in an act of self-interest on our part? Ladies and gentlemen, I would put to you, we have failed in that space. And we need to reinvent the way we look at Indonesia, and the way we look at the space and our neighbours, and Papua New Guinea. So you think about it, if you were to operate from, let's just say from Ambon, and of course this is just completely hypothetical, you would probably need to have security, I would contend, out to 120mm mortar range, which is about 10 kilometres. Because they're easy to deploy, they're hard to hide, they're hard to pick out, and easy to operate, and they're very readily available. You can pick another weapon platform if you like, but this is just one for the exercise. You would need essentially, in my estimation, based on my experience having worked in the brigade headquarters, probably about a brigade to do it, to protect it. Now you could do that hopefully in collaboration with the TNI. But you need to think about that as a potential operating spot. And to do that, you really need a joint task force. You need the Army to work with the Navy, to work with the Air Force, and vice versa. Now there's a radical thought. Now we've spent decades working in conjunction in almost all the conflicts we've fought to our principal allies. I think we need to reinvent our thinking and see as our natural security partner the one that we've called Camaria in the past. Indonesia does not posture its defence forces south. It never has. It doesn't see us as a threat. It gets annoyed at us when we poke them in the eye over beef, boats, spies, Papua, Jerusalem and Timor, in our clod-hopping, culturally insensitive manner, but they don't really fear us. They like us. Most of the senior elites have got properties in Australia. They send their kids to school here. So we're really dependent on an Indonesian welcome for our own sake. If we want to be able to operate in a way that will protect Australia and our interests in the neighbourhood, we need to be working on confidence building, engagement, languages, culture, and so on. When you think about Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy, I think there are modest Australian expectations. US can offer only limited help economically. They're not in a strong position to complement our trade options. There's some prospect for enhanced resilience, but there's more competitive than complementary businesses going on there. And we have Indigenous Australian capability requirements. I put up here a picture of a book by Andrew Ross, Armed and Ready, about the industrial redevelopment of the late 1930s. It's a longer period than that, but the main focus is on the late 1930s. We forget how much effort was put in the last few years of the 1930s to prepare us for the conflict that followed. And at the time it was quite controversial. A lot of people, there were many naysayers for the investment in Australian industry. I think there are sobering, as I say, it's not a facsimile, it's not the same, but there are parallels, there are echoes of that experience that are sobering for us to think about today. Now, when it comes to defence, there's obviously interoperability and intelligence benefits from our work with the United States, but we clearly need to bolster redundancy due to the limited surge capacity in quantity of equipment and spares and personnel. In terms of US expectations, we've got this kind of two-sided dimension to our thinking. We fear entrapment and we fear abandonment. You can't have one without the others. And we have to balance that fear of us being perhaps sucked into a Taiwanese war vortex, and at the same time the Americans no longer coming to our defence. This is a real conundrum, that it's an ongoing dialectical challenge that we have to get our heads around. In the same time, there's this issue about us being an independent nation and a dependent nation. Well, in some respects, Coral Bell's right, and still is right. We are dependent. But on the other side, Shannon Tow is also right. We are an independent. We have agency. We actually make our own calls. They're influenced by our alliance and by other factors, but they're enduring. So when we think about that, there's a list of issues there. I won't dwell on them now because we're running out of time. But essentially, there's a number of dimensions to the bilateral relationship that are worth exploring further and considering the implications of. And here's a really important point. The ADF capacity is small. It cannot sustain attrition in substantial conflict. It's essentially a one-punch force. It's an army of maybe 1 to 2 divisions, a navy of a dozen or so warships and a handful of subs, and an air force of only really about 100 fighters and supporting aircraft. Now that's all well and good for the good old early days of the post-Cold War years. We're in a different world, and we haven't adjusted. And the defence update is a step in the right direction. It's a step. And given all the challenges we faced this year with pandemics and fires before that, and pestilence and challenges around the world, our police and response services have limited capacity as well. Now we've got, and I know Tony Hoyer's here, who's kindly brought this to my attention. There is this existing national training education centres, but they're limited in capacity, and they're not really postured for the challenges we've got facing us. Disaster Institute for Disaster Resilience, the American FEMA, Australian Defence College and the APS Academy. There's more we need to do in this space. So I've talked before about a plan B. We had a foreign policy plan B. I think we need a defence plan B. I think the defence update was heading in that direction, but we need more. We need political and societal reawakening for open-eyed engagement with respect to the three-dimensional challenges concerning the environment, contestation and governance, informed by an appreciation of the place for industry and technology. We need to establish a National Institute of Net Assessment to address the three challenges holistically, and I think this could be placed at the ANU. And the ANU has just established a new institute for climate, energy and disaster solutions. I think that's a step in the right direction, but it's not nearly enough. I'm talking about something much more holistic, and that enables us to do a net assessment of the spectrum of challenges we face, harnessing the full spectrum of resources we as a nation can muster, and effectively planning out not just for the next electoral cycle, but for the sake of our grandkids. And nobody's really doing that. Nobody's thinking about our grandkids. We need to strike a grand compact with the Pacific, and I've argued this in the Australian Foreign Affairs magazine a couple of times now, addressing some parliamentary joint committees, advocating this line, engaging these small island states that are subject to significant risk of environmental catastrophe, and offer them a deal, a bit like New Zealand and the United States have done with their Pacific compacts. We need to deepen trade and security ties with Indonesia, with ASEAN, with the US, with the Quad, with anybody really. We need to reimagine our engagement with Antarctica. In 50 years' time, when our grandkids are in positions of authority, will Australia be black and burnt and Antarctica green and lush? I don't know, but it's not inconceivable. And we face serious competition over the 40% of Antarctica that we claim. Serious competition. We also forget that in that space, in which we will probably, in the next generation, see a surge in human habitation, a number of land borders with nations that you and I have never thought of as being our land borders. Chile, Argentina, Norway, Britain, New Zealand, France. Land borders, ladies and gentlemen, with our claims. We have dropped our thinking on this. So, okay, we can just walk away. Sure. Do we want it? We need to be having a discussion about this. And I think we need to bolster the police, the ADF, the security and emergency services, their ability to endure and be resilient. And I think we need to do that by bolstering ties with the range of partners here. The Quad, the FPDA, ASEAN. Manis is the Indonesian word for sweet. It's what I would propose to you as a Maritime Regional Cooperation Forum for Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, Singapore. When I mentioned it to Indonesians, their eyes light up. And then the other ones there. We need to bolster the cyber force, domestic security in our border force, and I think we need to develop an Australian universal scheme for national and community service to resource, human resource-wise, these agencies to do their jobs. Now, if unemployment is a problem, which it appears to be, this may well be something we can do to help. I've rabbited on too long, ladies and gentlemen. I apologise for going so long. There's more we could talk about, but I should stop at this point and invite questions. Thank you.